Dear church, let's talk apologetics. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, as always, Chris McCurley, joined by my friend and co-worker Blake Dozier, who's been with us the last couple of weeks as we're talking apologetics. We've entitled this series No Apologies, and let's kind of review. So The first week we talked about considering the evidence,
right?
How Jesus never said to follow him blindly, that blind faith is actually an oxymoron. And so we talked about that. Last week, we talked about just kind of setting the Bible aside for a moment. I think we looked at Romans 1 and then did that. But we talked about how there's plenty of evidence for the existence of a designer or a creator outside of Scripture when you look at nature and various functions of the body, DNA, morality. We looked at all those different kind of things. And then today, I want us to focus on miracles, basically. We can talk about some other things, but that's kind of where I want this conversation to go. There is, among many who are opponents to Christianity and the Bible and Jesus, perhaps, that would say that miracles should be off the table because they're supernatural. They're silly. You can't really base a faith on that. But talk a little bit about how that presupposition is flawed and how that miracles can play a part in this if we're going to be open to considering every piece of evidence.
Right. Well, the order of these podcasts is important.
Yeah.
And the reason we did last week's podcast the way that we did is because this week's podcast builds upon it.
Yeah.
And so I think the first thing for us to step back and look and consider is if the evidence points us towards some sort of a supreme being. I won't even use the word God yet. Mm-hmm. Just this supreme being that exists outside of time and space, which I believe the evidence does point us there.
Sure.
Then it is at least logically possible for miracles to happen.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, I think we kind of get in a rut as a scientific society and using science to make great gains. We kind of compartmentalize and we kind of assume that anything factual has to be scientific or I might observable, and I might even go further and to say, have a naturalistic explanation. And so, an astute listener last week would have picked up on the fact that I mentioned that oftentimes when something unexplainable like happens in our home, some people would say, "Oh, that's a ghost." When I was talking to the teenagers, and I said, "Oh no, the reason that you think that is because we don't believe something happens without a cause."
Right.
And then over here we're going to talk about miracles. And am I going to say the opposite? No. Well, when we don't understand something, we're just going to say it was a miracle and it happens without a cause. Yeah. That's the issue I think that most of the world has with miracles.
And I think that's what some Christians default to sometimes.
I think so. And so on one hand, we're pushing everyone to be reasonable. And then are we jumping ship when we come over to this other conversation and say, yeah, but this was a miracle and this was a miracle. And we read through Scripture and all over it talks about miracles having occurred.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's why it's important to have the conversation that we had last week.
Right.
I do not believe that we should jump to miracles as the explanation for everything that we don't understand. I don't believe that is meant to be just this stopgap to fill in our lack of knowledge. I think that we should use science and we should be skeptical. I think that we should ask really hard questions, and I think we should only land on the determination that something miraculous happened if there is absolutely no other explanation.
Yeah.
But I will say this. It is not logically impossible for this supreme being that exists to still interact with creation in a way that is miraculous.
I agree. I think there's sometimes as Christians, you see that they will allow miracles to be the first resort.
Right.
We're saying they should be the last resort, actually.
I
Really,
think so.
when you think about it, I mean, there are Christians who, everything's a miracle. They blame everything in their life on a miracle from God. I'm going to Walmart and I'm driving around the parking lot and it's raining and God opens up a parking spot for me right up front. It's a miracle. Everything's a crazy God story. No, that's not true. And I think that we only hurt our arguments in our defense of Christianity, our apologetics, by doing that.
Right.
I want our audience today to think of miracles as a last resort. However, like you just said, they got to be on the table.
Right.
They do. And this presupposition that, we can't include miracles in our arguments because they're supernatural, they're unexplainable, and therefore they're not observable and all that kind of thing. No, I think there's a place, and we want to put them in the proper place this podcast as we talk about this.
As we are examining Scripture, we're really looking back at some historical documents. Mm-hmm. And a big, maybe it's debate isn't the right word, but a big question for us to consider when we're looking at history is, can we look back over history and uncover or observe a miracle? Is it appropriate to place a miracle in the historical timeline? If you were a historian, could you claim a miracle had happened? A lot of this particular podcast that we're going to talk comes from material that I learned in reading a book by Mike Licona on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he spends an enormous amount of time at the beginning of the book talking about the horizons. You use the word presuppositions. He used the phrase horizons that historians bring to the table. And so if you are going to examine history, and you come to the table assuming that miracles are an absolute no, well then you're going to interpret maybe these historical events, be forced to interpret some historical events one way. Yeah. If you come to the table with miracles being a possibility, even if they aren't a probability, they're at least a possibility, then that kind of gives you another option to examine.
Yes.
And Mike Licona, myself, I would say every Christian has to at least admit that it is a possibility. In fact, I would say based on our conversation last week, any honest thinker would have to admit it's at least a possibility. Yeah. And so that opens the floodgates to examining some powerful historical truths and asking ourselves the question, was God at work in this supreme being that we have identified that must exist to explain all that we see? Has he stepped in and interacted with his creation in the past in a way that we can see and observe? Yeah. And as Christians, I believe absolutely yes. In fact, I would say throughout history, the Bible lays out multiple times where he has done that, but none so powerful as in the miracle of the resurrection of Jesus Christ,
which is the linchpin of our faith. And that's why the subject of miracles is such a sticking point with those who have trouble buying into Christianity, is because we hang everything on the resurrection. We can talk about miracles and the miracles that Jesus performed, the miracles the apostles did, but ultimately we're talking about the biggest miracle being the resurrection of Jesus, that he was dead, that he rose again, because obviously if that's not true, then everything we believe and everything that we hold dear is a farce.
Well, and Paul says the exact same thing in 1 Corinthians 15. He says in verse 12, "Now if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain."
Right.
In other words, this really is the central question of Christianity. Was Christ raised from the dead or not? Because if he wasn't, this is a joke. Yeah. This is a waste. Everything that we say and do has no meaning, no lasting meaning, at least. Yeah. And it really is a sad existence that we live if it's not true.
Yeah, right.
But if Christ was raised from the dead, that's a really big deal. That means that this supreme being had to have come down and interacted with his creation.
Yeah.
That means that this supreme being did something big. And from that, it follows that if Christ was raised from the dead, and the scripture accurately presents that there's other truths in scripture that are accurately presented. Mm-hmm. It follows that Jesus was from God, and we can trust the things that he said. The things that he say have powerful ramifications for how we view ourselves, how we live life, how we view the afterlife. And all of a sudden, based on that one miracle, all the other pieces start falling in place. And Christianity and the God of the Bible becomes the God that we were looking at, instead of this mystical supreme being that has to exist.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that the resurrection of Christ is a important starting point for us who are working to defend our faith. Yeah. If we're gonna examine the historical reliability of a miracle, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the one that we should start with.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's really the miracle that I would like for us to talk about today.
Yeah.
Let's throw some of the facts out there.
Yep.
Did it happen or did it not?
Yeah, and let's back up a little bit and establish some things that are consensus that virtually everyone agrees with. Christian, non-Christian, atheist, believer, most folks would say that Jesus existed, that he is a historical figure.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say maybe even more than most. Almost all, virtually all reputable scholars would agree that Jesus was a historical character, right. And that's across all different worldviews, all different religions, from atheist to agnostic to Christian to Jew, and all different types of faith systems. Jesus Christ is accepted as a historical character.
That's not where we start. That's not a point of contention. The other thing is, and I think I said most a while ago, maybe even virtually too, believe that he died, that he was crucified.
Yes.
Now there are some that would debate that, and there are some theories out there. One that I know of particularly was the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he passed out, and when he was laid in the tomb, the cold air hit him, he was revived, and he left the tomb and did mission work in India for a while, and then passed away, and he's buried somewhere there. But I mean, when you start looking at the different theories to try to get around the fact that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried, I mean, it's more plausible to believe that he died on the cross, but way more plausible to believe that he was crucified, that he died on the cross. Plus, if you know anything of Roman history, people didn't survive the crucifixion.
No.
And we do know historically it was an instrument of execution that was commonly used by the Romans. And we also know that people didn't walk away from a crucifixion.
No. I mean, the Romans were good at what they did.
Yes, absolutely.
And crucifixion was designed not only to kill, but to humiliate and inflict misery on the person who was being killed.
It was calculated.
If I remember correct in my reading, there's maybe one example historically we have of someone surviving a crucifixion, and it doesn't sound like the beating leading up to it was the same, and they were taken down quickly, and they received very immediate medical care.
Yeah.
When we look at what happened to Jesus, which most scholars would agree actually happened to him, that he was crucified.
Yes.
When we look at the events that led up to it, when we look at the physiology of what happens in a crucifixion, to say that somehow he didn't die, and without medical care, multiple days later was able to wake up and walk out of this tomb, not to mention the complexities of the stone and the guards, and I mean all of the powerful religious and political leaders in the area who wanted him dead and would have been extra aware of what was happening. there's just a lot of things that don't fit with that theory.
And not to mention what he went through before the crucifixion.
Right.
That would have been enough to kill most people.
Yes.
There's a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Many have heard of that. But in that book, Dr. Alexander Metherell walks through the crucifixion and what it did to his body. He looks at it physiologically, biologically. He walks through that and how, those different things that he suffered would have led to his death. And it's sort of like an anatomy of the crucifixion, an anatomy of death on a cross.
Right.
And ultimately, crucifixion's death by asphyxiation.
Right.
You end up not being able to breathe, and so your lungs fill with blood. The heart, the pericardium, or the lining of the heart, fills with water, which would have explained when they pierced his side, water and blood flowing out. But one thing that Dr. Alexander Metherell makes very clear is people didn't survive this. People didn't live through a crucifixion because the Roman guards, it was in their best interest that somebody did die.
Absolutely.
Because if they lived, then they were in trouble. So the rub is not, did Jesus exist? There's a consensus there, even with people who aren't Christians that are scholars. That he was killed, that he was crucified. The rub exists then. Is he still in the tomb somewhere?
Right.
Or did he rise from the dead? That's really where the tension comes.
Well, and it is universally, not universally, almost universally accepted. The vast majority of scholars would also agree that at the very least, there was groupings of people who believed, who thought that they had seen the resurrected Jesus.
Yeah.
And that would
eyewitness
be
accounts.
That would be an indisputable or a seldom disputed fact by scholars, atheists, agnostic, regardless of religion or worldview, would accept the fact that there were groupings of people who believed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. And I've read several different scholars. One of them, I think to maybe build our case, I would like to read a quote from him. It's Bart Ehrman is his name.
Okay.
I would say Bart Ehrman has done more to undermine Christianity in the last maybe grouping of 15, 20 years than almost any other. He's written on a really popular level to a lot of people. He's an agnostic at best, a New Testament scholar that does not believe anything that the New Testament says.
Yeah.
Or I should say he believes much of what the New Testament says, but not the truth claims of Christ and who he was.
Right.
He says this: "It is indisputable that some of the followers of Jesus came to think that he had been raised from the dead, and something had to have happened to make them think so. Our earliest records are consistent on this point, and I think they provide us with historically reliable information in one key respect. The disciples' belief in the resurrection was based on visionary experiences."
Yeah, it's pretty telling.
I mean, that's a powerful statement
It
from
is.
someone who doesn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God or that he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
And so, and I could have quotes from him and other atheists on the other points that we've made. And so the reason, now we could look at other, what I would say, historical facts that play a part in building this case for the resurrection.
Yes.
But these three that we have just laid out, the fact that Jesus existed, the fact that he died by crucifixion, and the fact that he was thought to have appeared by many of his close followers are agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars.
Yeah.
We're setting aside anything that there's debate upon and saying, okay, what are these core central facts that we could sit around the table with these loud voices for atheism.
Yeah.
And we could all come to a consensus on those three facts.
Yep. Yep.
And so,
and even, we default to Scripture because of who we are.
Right.
But, even in Scripture, the Jewish leaders didn't deny the resurrection.
right.
They tried to come up with some story to be spread
Right.
so that, it wasn't believed. But even they didn't try to deny
Right.
what had happened.
Right.
They tried to go around that
Right.
So that it wouldn't seem that that's what happened.
Right.
But even they didn't deny it. So you have that as well.
Yeah.
But you also have, I know you're going to talk about this as well, some who try to get around even this idea that Jesus appeared to folks.
Right.
One of them is this kind of idea of this mass hallucination. This theory that everybody who saw Jesus after his resurrection were hallucinating. They didn't really see him. They saw a ghost or something else. But, you think about Paul talking about Jesus appearing to 500.
Right.
So all of them were hallucinating at the same time?
Well, and the hallucination theory, I mean, that really probably is one of the most common objections. In other words, they thought that he appeared, but he didn't really appear.
Right.
And that's where a lot of these scholars would head. They would say, okay, we agree with you that they believed that, but it didn't really happen.
Right.
Okay, how?
Yeah.
Well, the mass hallucination theory. It was these believers were in a state of severe emotional stress, and that stress brought on this hallucination. That's a pretty difficult one to claim. I mean, it's funny when we choose to follow science and when we choose to leave science, and we can be pretty inconsistent based on our biases. But we have no documented evidence anywhere of even two people sharing a hallucination.
Yeah.
A hallucination is very much an individual experience.
Yeah.
Well, we would all agree that he didn't just appear. This wasn't just a hallucination by one person and we can wave our hands and dismiss it. We agree that he appeared to large groups of multiple people.
Absolutely.
That's not a disputed fact. So to claim that an hallucination occurred
among 500 people,
among that many people, just doesn't fit with what we know about modern psychology and how that would
That's
work.
pretty far-fetched.
Yeah.
Another theory that I hear a lot is that simply the disciples lied.
Yeah.
They just made it all up.
This was a big conspiracy. We love conspiracy theories.
So this was a big conspiracy to further their movement.
Yeah.
But now that one falls apart, obviously, is they died for that lie.
Yeah, that's a difficult claim to make. Were it one person?
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably say they were so committed, they had convinced themselves to the point of maybe even being mentally ill. And they had convinced themselves something that was true was not, and they carried it to their death. We're talking about, at the very least, we have the 12 apostles who were very central in this, and they carried this message to the world at extreme cost to themselves.
Yeah.
Almost all of them were martyred for their faith. So to get one person on board with a conspiracy theory, maybe two, maybe three, I mean, how do you get 12? And the circle was indeed much bigger than that.
Oh, yes.
How do you get, but how would you even get 12 people to carry a conspiracy this far without one of them recanting or changing direction?
Yeah.
And we know this group of close followers, disciples, was much larger than that. We know he appeared to at least 500. I mean, how did this conspiracy theory not at least start breaking down on the periphery? What would cause them to carry it to such extreme? Almost all of them died for their belief. We have no account of them recanting under the threat of death. I think we can confidently say that they were absolutely convinced that this was truth.
Yeah, I think so too.
So this wasn't just some mirage they had in their head. This wasn't some questionable thing. This wasn't them gathering together in the dark of night and saying, "Hey, I have an idea. Let's just say this thing happened, and I won't tell if you won't tell." That's not how people work.
Right.
That wouldn't have happened.
That wouldn't have happened. You don't die for a lie.
This this lie was so big and so central and so religiously and politically charged in that area where it was happening. The pressure to expose that lie would have been ginormous.
Yeah.
And so that's really not a tenable explanation for why we see
Agreed.
these things happening.
So an even more far-fetched than that is this pagan myth theory.
Okay, so there are a group of people that just basically wave their hand and say, this is all a myth. In fact, this might even back up further to arguing with our very first point, that Jesus even existed. I mean, they might agree that he was a historical character, but they would say pretty much all of his life and teachings and death and resurrection, it was all a myth. It was all fabricated. Yeah. None of it happened. And what they would base that argument on is that there are other mythological pagan gods that maybe have a few similarities to the Christ story. So they'll talk about Horus and Mithras and Dionysus and Attis. And I would agree that there are a number of small facts about these myths that match the story of Jesus. But the problems with that is, first of all, Jesus was an actual historical character, and none of these others seem to be.
True.
The supposed parallels between these events are highly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Horus, for instance, was stung by a scorpion. He was not crucified. Osiris wasn't resurrected, but returned to live in the underworld. Dionysus's mother was impregnated by Zeus, wasn't a virgin. Attis is one I mentioned, sprung forth from a rock and not a human.
Right.
So while there are some tiny similarities, the differences far outweigh the similarities. And I would further argue that just because there are parallels, it doesn't prove anything. And so I feel like that's an argument that can be pretty appealing to especially some of our younger generation. It's thrown out there oftentimes in a way to just kind of wave away, well, there's all of these other mythological things that happen that are basically the same story.
How's Jesus any different?
Yeah, they just hijacked the same story and somehow it got this more central part in history, and here we are believing a pagan myth.
Right.
That's intellectually dishonest to present those myths as if they share that much in common with the story of Jesus. It's very different in the central claims of Jesus, born of a virgin, died on the cross, resurrected as a walking human, going up into heaven. Very different.
So,
yes.
All that said,
okay,
we come back to resurrection.
Yeah, I mean,
which is a miracle, obviously the biggest miracle ever.
Right.
I mean, it changed the world. It changed the way we calculate time. BC and AD. I mean, it changed everything.
Yes.
The biggest event, the most important event in the history of the world.
Yeah.
So we can't dismiss it with these kind of theories.
Right.
I mean, at least not being intellectually honest, like you said, or intellectually lazy. So we come back to resurrection, the biggest miracle of all. What do we do with that?
Man, I mean, here's the deal. There's really no other answer that makes sense.
Yeah.
When you look at those three key facts, there's really no other answer that makes sense.
Yeah.
If miracles are off the table, we have to jump through some really crazy explanations to make all of these historical facts fit.
Yeah.
And there's just holes in every explanation that historians have been able to come up with that shelves miracles and says, nope, I'm not considering that.
Yeah.
If we admit that there is a supreme being, and this is at least possible, the resurrection is absolutely the best explanation for what we see.
Yeah.
And Chris, that changes everything.
It does.
In fact, I would say it very quickly follows that if the resurrection is true, then Jesus was absolutely God interacting in this creation. That means that the claims that Jesus made were also true. I mean, that's the evidence that pointed the disciples to that, and it can point us to that as well. Jesus claimed that Scripture was from God. And so that means that the Bible that we hold, or at least the Old Testament that Jesus had, was the divine revelation from this supreme being. So it teaches us something about God.
Yeah.
It also means that Jesus' teaching about what the Spirit was going to do with the apostles is true. And so it means that truth was revealed through the apostles. And so all of a sudden the pieces start falling in place for the New Testament also being inspired. And then as we look through the New Testament, we see we see a case being built for both the inspiration of the Old Testament and the New Testament side by side.
Sure.
And so my iPad's being mad at me.
Well, not only that, but you go back to our first 2 episodes in this series.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to see that we have a creator, a designer of all this, like we say, we haven't jumped to this being God necessarily. We are now, but at that point, we were talking about just, we readily admit that, these things didn't just come out of nothing. That there's a designer. We made the case for that. And so if you build a case and you come around to the idea that there is a God, there is a designer, a creator of the universe, which is epic, right? Mm-hmm. Then it's not that far of a jump or a leap to say that God could come to this earth in the form of a human, be crucified, died, buried, and rise again on the 3rd day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not out of our bounds to say, and that God chose to reveal himself in this way. He chose to reveal himself through this written word.
Yes.
And he chose to reveal these stories through this written word. And in other words, God, the supreme being, chose to tell us about who he is.
Yeah.
And the truth of what Scripture lays out about him. And I think I said this in the first session, but I'll say it again. Just to admit that there's a God is really scary. That there's something bigger than me is really scary.
Yeah.
When we learn about the type of God that he is, it becomes comforting. It becomes a kind of a sigh of relief, like, whew. I mean, it could have been anything.
Right.
This supreme being, it could have been a harsh.
Dictator.
It could have been a harsh master that created us to torture us for his pleasure. Mm-hmm. And what we find instead through Scripture is the story of redemption, of a creator who lovingly created us and has given us the freedom of choice.
Yeah.
And is working with this choice to redeem these terrible choices that we often make in a way that upholds our individual freedom, our ability to love in a way that maximally promotes goodness. I mean, it really is a miraculous reality that's laid out before us, that this is what it would be. Yeah. And it's really an exciting thing.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. So where do we go from here?
Well, we could go down several different roads. I mean, I do think that there's room for talking about the biblical text a little bit more. Okay. In fact, I would encourage probably some of our listeners to do some more research on that. Some would take it all the way to the point that we've gotten and say, okay, I mean, so God maybe does exist. Yeah. And maybe some of these miracles, specifically the resurrection of Jesus, really did happen. We would agree that's how the evidence, where the evidence best points us. Mm-hmm. But to claim that the Bible is actually a reliable source to gain information about him, they would then start to undermine that. And
yes.
And that's a difficult thing to do. The Scripture, I mean, we don't have a historical document that is even close.
Yeah.
In the number of manuscripts, in the uniformity among the manuscripts, in the closeness of age and writing between when the events happened and when these manuscripts occurred.
Yes.
It's, I would say, almost miraculous that we have as much evidence for the Bible as we do. And so we could go down that road for quite a while, but we may be belaboring the point to some of our listeners.
Well, and we do want to remind our listeners that they can go back on the Dear Church podcast. Right. We have previous episodes with Dr. Denny Petrillo where he talks about how we got the Bible and hits on some of those things. So we got one more episode that we're going to talk about next week. Give a preview.
I want to talk a little bit about while this matters.
Yeah.
And I really kind of want to jump from looking back into the past to looking to where we are now and kind of ask the question, okay, if God has revealed himself in the past and provided this evidence, this miraculous evidence, what's the evidence he provides for us today?
Yeah.
And I think we have a scriptural answer for that. And it's actually a pretty exciting to look at thing and a challenge for the church. And it all centers around love. And so we're going to talk about that next week.
Absolutely. It's going to be great. I hope you'll continue to tune in, and we appreciate you tuning in to this episode. If you have questions or comments about this episode, please feel free to email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. I'll share the email with Blake, and if you have a specific question for him, then certainly he'd be glad to answer that as well. We invite those comments as long as they are given in grace and as long as they are, for having a good, well thought out conversation.
Yeah.
We get plenty of comments on the podcast. Not all of them are worth our time to respond to.
Well, I think sometimes when, and Christians do this too, when our view is threatened, instead of responding and wanting to have a conversation, we poke.
Yes.
And so I don't want to be that way. And I want to have conversations, but we're not going to get in a poking match.
Right.
Where
well
we're
said.
just, yeah.
Yeah. We just want to encourage you to, if you'd like to have the discussion or carry on the discussion, we'd be glad to do so civilly and lovingly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning in, Blake. Thank you for being with us again.
I enjoyed it.
Till next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.